She thought it was just a checkup, but her body made the millionaire lose control. The early morning light filtered through the tall glass windows of St. Vincent Hospital, casting long golden streaks across the polished marble floor of the main lobby. The air carried the crisp chill of autumn, but Liana Monroe felt a different kind of heat, an anxious tightness beneath her ribs, as if every breath carried the weight of something she hadn't allowed herself to remember. She stood before the full-length mirror in the staff break room, adjusting the collar of her white coat one last time. Her chestnut hair was swept into a neat bun, and the sharpness in her eyes was carefully softened by a thin line of mascara. Everything appeared perfect, as always. But perfection couldn't hide the subtle tremble in the hand, holding the required medical screening form. "Just a routine," she whispered to herself. Nothing more. But the moment she stepped into the small examination room on the third floor, that fragile self-assurance shattered completely. The man inside had his back to her, typing something into a tablet. She didn't need him to turn around. That frame, tall, confident, impossibly familiar, was one her mind had tried and failed to forget. Julian Hale. Time could change many things, but not the memory of someone etched so deeply into her bones. The last time she'd seen him was 20 years ago in a cramped Boston apartment, surrounded by silence and an unspoken goodbye. "Ms. Monroe?" He turned, and their eyes met. For one suspended second, the world held its breath. She nodded, voice steady despite the storm inside. "Yes, I'm here for the onboarding physical." He nodded as well, the calm in his demeanor betrayed only by the flicker in his eyes, those same dark eyes she once loved, once lost, now staring back at her across a decade of distance. "Please, have a seat," he said. His voice was deeper than she remembered. Liana moved toward the examination table, gripping the edge of her coat like an anchor. Julian handed her a clipboard of forms to fill out. Their conversation stayed clinical. Medical history, allergies, standard questions. But every word felt like reopening an old wound. She remembered their last morning, the smell of coffee, the radio playing softly, the promise to find a way through the distance. And then, silence. His hand brushed her wrist as he checked her pulse, the contact sending sparks straight through her spine. They both pretended it meant nothing. Their breath said otherwise. "Elevated heart rate," he said, half joking. "White coat syndrome," she replied, managing a light smile. They locked eyes. Two people who had once loved too deeply and lost too painfully, now standing face to face beneath fluorescent lights. The exam ended in silence. She stood, smoothing her coat, ready to leave, when his voice stopped her, soft as breath, but enough to still her hand on the doorknob. "You still have that look, like you're about to change everything around you." She turned, just for a moment, and met his gaze, still the same despite the years. A small, wistful smile touched her lips, and without a word, she stepped out. But she knew. Everything had already started to shift. Her first day blurred by in a haze of charts, patient briefings, and rapid-fire introductions. Liana moved through the long, sterile corridors of St. Vincent Hospital, where the fluorescent lights felt too cold to calm the heartbeat that hadn't quite settled since that morning. She didn't mention Julian's name to anyone. No need. This was work. She was a surgeon. The past was just that, past. But her heart wasn't a medical file she could reorganize with logic. It faltered each time someone casually said, "Dr. Hale." Her feet, betraying her better judgment, found their way to the physical therapy wing, Julian's territory. There, during a morning case review, they stood across from each other for the first time in front of others. No one spoke of history, but the way their eyes locked made even time pause for a beat. Then came an emergency. A cyclist had dislocated his shoulder in an accident and was rushed into surgery. Julian was paged for consultation. Liana happened to be the attending surgeon on call. Cooperation was inevitable. "I need to extend into the anterior cartilage," Liana said, her focus fixed on the ultrasound image. Julian nodded. "I'll stabilize the subscapularis tendon. We need to move fast before the hematoma spreads." They didn't need more than that. Like old times when they were just residents, they worked as if on instinct, flawlessly coordinated. When the procedure ended, Liana peeled off her gloves, washing her hands in silence. Julian stood beside her, also quiet. But the way he leaned just enough to grab her a paper towel, setting it down gently beside the sink, not too close, not too far, made her chest ache. Outside, she leaned against the wall in the corridor and closed her eyes. Memories surged of their first overnight shift nearly 20 years ago. He'd fumbled with the coffee machine. She'd kept him awake with silly jokes. They had laughed, yawned, fallen asleep on the same battered couch just before sunrise. Liana sat alone in the physician lounge, morning light flooding in from the wide window, softening the sterile scent of antiseptic. In front of her, a cup of black coffee, strong, hot, and bitter, exactly the way she and Julian used to drink it during med school. A breeze whispered through the open window, and with it, the past came rushing back. They had first met in the university library, both reaching for the last copy of Functional Anatomy of the Musculoskeletal System. Julian let her take it, and the next day showed up with a carefully bound photocopy. "Consider it an apology for grabbing the last one," he said with that half-smile, the one that had once unraveled her so easily. Endless nights of exam prep. They'd sit side by side in a quiet study hall, surrounded by plastic skeletons and neuron charts. She was structured, disciplined. He was spontaneous, instinctive. Somehow, it worked. They fit. She once fell ill during finals week, feverish, pale, too stubborn to rest. Julian never said much, but he showed up with medicine, hot soup, and a note that read, "You're not allowed to crash. Who else will proofread my notes?" They used to dream together of opening a sports injury clinic for kids, of training abroad in Europe, of walking into the future side by side. But dreams faltered, distance grew, and a misunderstanding, never confronted, pulled them apart. Liana blinked, pulling herself back into the present. Memories never stayed buried, not when the heart still held on. Now just feet apart, but a lifetime away. Liana opened her eyes and exhaled. Down the hall, Julian was speaking with a nurse, sunlight streaming through the windows and catching the edge of his white coat. And there she was, watching him again, like that 22-year-old girl she once was. She smiled to herself. This feeling shouldn't still exist. But it did, unfaded, unguarded, and maybe dangerous. Wednesday morning brought a gentle drizzle, blurring the sharp outlines of New York beneath a silvery veil. On the 4th floor, the case review room buzzed with a little more energy than usual. Liana had arrived early, seated in the corner, her eyes on her laptop, but her ears were tuned to every movement beyond the door. It opened suddenly. A bright, confident voice rang out. "Eliza Warren, sorry I'm late. MRI decided to test my patients this morning." Liana looked up. The woman who entered carried a presence that lifted the entire room. Eliza wore a white coat embroidered with her name, paired with bold red sneakers. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a low ponytail, her posture a mix of ease and confidence. She walked briskly to the seat beside Julian, and that, in itself, wasn't what struck Liana. It was the way Julian smiled when he saw her, the way he leaned in to whisper something that made Eliza laugh softly. But even amidst their shared smiles and quiet jokes, Liana caught Julian's eyes flick toward her. Just for a second too long to be nothing. And in that glance she felt it. He was still aware of her. Throughout the meeting, Julian was composed, professional. He guided the discussion, offered precise input on the rehab protocols being proposed. Yet every time Liana spoke, every time she nodded in agreement, his eyes would drift toward her again. Briefly, gently, but unmistakably. Was it curiosity? Surprise? Something else? Whatever it was, that look lingered longer than it should have. And it unsettled her. She reminded herself, this was work. They were colleagues. The past was done, closed. But her heart, unruly and disobedient, pulsed with every glance he stole. Not at Eliza, but at her. After the meeting, Liana lingered in the staff lounge. Through the large window overlooking the courtyard, she saw Julian and Eliza walking together under the drizzle. He shrugged off his coat and placed it gently around her shoulders, an unconscious, practiced gesture. Eliza laughed, said something that made him tilt his head and smile. Then they parted at a fork in the walkway. Liana exhaled. She didn't dislike Eliza, but she hated the feeling of being replaced. And for the first time, it became painfully clear, even if he still looked her way, the distance between them might already be too far. Liana had begun to realize a glance wasn't always enough to bridge the distance silence and time had created. And just then, someone else entered her life, quietly, but at the right moment. That day, as Liana read through patient files at the nurse's station, a soft male voice broke the hum around her. "You looked so focused, I started wondering if I was interrupting something life-saving." She looked up and met the amused gaze of Adrian Blake, a businessman investing in the hospital's new rehab and sports performance wing. They'd first met at an internal planning session where Adrian had pitched a model integrating sports, medicine, and tech. He carried himself with calm confidence and an uncanny ability to read a room, or a person. "You're Dr. Monroe, right?" he continued. "I remember your shoulder joint presentation last week. Genuinely impressive." She offered a polite smile. "Thank you. You probably say that to every doctor." "No," he replied. "Only to the ones I actually want to hear more from." It didn't make her blush, but it did make her feel noticed. Not for a shared past, but for her present. A few days later, Adrian invited her to lunch. She hesitated. It had been a long time since she'd let anyone step into her life, and the hesitation itself made her wonder, was she trying to live, or just trying to forget someone else's eyes? She said yes. The lunch was simple, a cozy Italian place on 72nd Street. Adrian talked about his former life as a junior tennis athlete, the injury that ended his career, and his pivot into investing in health initiatives for young athletes. His story wasn't dramatic. It was honest, measured, real. Liana felt calm, no racing pulse, no memories crashing in, just two adults looking for something kind in a noisy world. But as they stepped out of the restaurant, the air shifted. Across the street, Julian stood outside a bookstore, clearly just leaving. He saw her, with Adrian. His eyes landed on her hand, resting lightly on Adrian's sleeve in a casual gesture of thanks. He didn't wave, didn't walk over, just looked, and turned away. Liana stood still for a moment, then turned back to Adrian with a soft, practiced smile. But something inside her had already gone quiet. She tried to treat the lunch with Adrian as nothing more than a polite outing. But the moment Julian turned away in silence, Liana realized, some feelings, no matter how old, could still break her like the first time. A week later, the hospital's internal newsletter landed in every staff member's inbox. The subject line read, "St. Vincent representatives at the 2025 International Sports Medicine Conference." Liana clicked without much thought until the first image loaded. Julian and Eliza. They stood side by side on stage, smiling brightly. Julian's hand rested lightly on Eliza's back while she leaned slightly into him as they accepted their awards. The way they looked at each other, stood that close. It didn't look like just colleagues anymore. Almost instantly, whispers spread through the hospital corridors. Julian and Eliza are a thing. They've been close for a while now. That new surgeon doesn't stand a chance. Liana never heard the words directly, but she felt the glances, the half-pauses in conversation when she entered a room, the silent conclusions drawn behind friendly smiles. Something inside her shifted. The calm she had fought so hard to maintain began to fracture. She didn't ask Julian. She didn't ask Eliza either. She just withdrew. But in that silence, everything grew louder: hurt, doubt, and distance. She began to avoid any meeting where Julian might be present. For joint surgeries, she quietly requested to be reassigned. Overbooked, she told them, even when her schedule was perfectly clear. She stopped smiling at Adrian's morning texts. Her replies became shorter, colder, because inside, everything felt too heavy to carry, let alone share. At night, in her short-term rental apartment, she sat staring at her laptop. The image again, Julian and Eliza under soft stage lights, smiling like two people perfectly at ease with each other. No drama, no distance, no questions. Liana stared at the photo. No tears, no rage, just a quiet ache, as if she had just lost something she never really had back. She closed the screen, buried her face in the pillow, and for the first time since returning to New York, she felt completely alone. In the days that followed, Liana became almost invisible in the very place she worked. She avoided Julian, kept her distance from others, and filled her schedule with solo surgeries, minimal interaction, no unnecessary contact. She believed silence would protect her. But in truth, silence only gave space for doubt to grow, inside her head and even deeper in her heart. Julian didn't ask. She didn't explain. They passed each other like strangers who once shared something intimate, now barely acknowledging with a nod. It might have continued that way, indefinitely, until that Monday morning. Both were assigned to a multidisciplinary case review, one neither of them could avoid. They sat at opposite ends of the table, presenting their parts like professionals. No flicker of familiarity, no warmth. But when the meeting ended, Julian waited outside the room. For the first time in weeks, their eyes met, without looking away. "Liana," he said quietly. His voice wasn't angry, just heavy, like someone holding back a question for far too long. There was a long silence. And then, "Liana," Julian said her name again, firmer this time, more certain. The hallway on the 6th floor was empty, filled only with the soft hum of air vents and the dull glow of overhead lights. She turned slowly, her eyes tired, too tired to pretend anymore. "What do you want?" Her voice was soft, but not weak. It was a curtain, part protection, part warning. Julian stepped closer, stopping at a careful distance. "Why have you been avoiding me?" Liana let out a breathless laugh, not amused, not sarcastic, just enough to keep tears from surfacing. "Do you really want to ask me that?" "What did I do that made you this angry?" he asked, his voice pressing gently but firmly. "It's not about anger," she said, her voice catching. "It's about exhaustion. I'm tired of pretending nothing happened. Tired of still feeling, when it's obvious you've moved on." Julian froze. Liana went on, not looking at him. "I saw you with Eliza, at the conference, in the halls. The way you looked at her, stood next to her. You don't need to say anything. That photo in the newsletter said enough." "You believe a picture more than you believe me?" Julian asked, his voice lower now. "It's not just the photo," she cut in. "It's everything. The way you look at her. The way you said nothing when I started pulling away. The way you've changed into someone I barely recognize." "And you disappeared," he said quietly. "No conversation, no questions, no space for me to explain anything." "Explain what?" Her voice broke, sharper now. That what I saw was just poor timing? That your smile meant nothing? That the way she looked at you, like she already knew, was all in my head? I keep showing up in a story that already ended for you. I keep feeling everything, while you seem to feel nothing. A silence settled between them, thick, painful. Julian looked at her, no longer composed. His eyes held something deeper now. Regret. "Liana," he began, stepping forward. "Don't," she said, cutting him off. "If you're about to say something that'll give me hope, don't." She turned, walking briskly toward the elevator just as the doors opened. Julian stood frozen. One step, just one, and he might have stopped her. But his feet never moved. Neither did his heart. He just stood there. And for the first time since she returned to New York, they truly stood on opposite sides. And no one turned back. The elevator doors closed behind Liana, swallowing all the words she hadn't said, and Julian's silent figure at the end of the hallway, growing smaller as the floors passed by. The rest of that day drifted like fog. She moved through it like a shadow, automatic, detached, her energy drained beyond exhaustion. Her eyes stayed dry, but everything inside her felt like glass on the edge of cracking. Because the weight of unshed tears tends to sit heavier than the ones that fall. The next morning, just as she stepped into her office, a nurse approached with a chart. "Emergency case. Complex knee trauma. Surgery requires both ortho and sports med." Dr. Hale initiated the consult. His name landed like a quiet blow to her chest. Her first instinct was to decline, walk away again. But something stopped her. How long could she keep running? And what exactly was she avoiding? Him or herself, maybe? It was time to face both. Operating room 3, 7:45 a.m. Liana stood at the scrub sink, the sharp scent of antiseptic filling her lungs. Each movement, rubbing fingers, palms, wrists, was precise, almost too slow, as if she needed time not just to prepare for surgery, but to brace herself emotionally. Behind her, the door opened. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. "Julian." He said nothing, just stepped beside her, scrubbing in silently. The only sound between them was the steady rush of water, yet the silence felt heavier than words. Minutes later, they entered the OR. The overhead lights cast a sterile glow over the operating table, where a young male athlete lay unconscious, prepped and ready. The case was complex: shredded cartilage, a torn ACL, a collaborative procedure between orthopedics and sports medicine. It had to be both of them. Julian stood on the left, Liana on the right. They didn't look at each other, but they didn't have to. Years of surgical synergy guided them. "Opening anterior chamber," Liana said, her voice calm but guarded. "Copy." Julian's hands were already in position. As the first incision was made, the air changed. No longer two fractured people, just two professionals, two hearts that once aligned, now working to save someone else's second chance. Time blurred in focused motion. No hesitation, no fumbled words. Every step was measured, precise, like a symphony they still remembered how to play. At one point, as Liana leaned in to retrieve a cartilage fragment, her gloved hand brushed Julian's. He paused, just for a second, not from discomfort, but recognition. She felt it too, but she didn't pull away, didn't look up. She simply continued. Once the ligament was stabilized and cartilage secured, Julian spoke softly. "Anything else you need?" "No," she said. "We're done." They stepped back, removed their gloves. Liana nodded to the team and turned to leave first. Julian followed a few steps behind. Outside, near the locker room, he called out, "Liana!" She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said, voice low and sincere. She paused, then replied quietly, "We're doctors. That's what we do. Not forgiveness, not bitterness, just truth. between two people who once knew each other deeply, now learning how to exist from a distance. The surgery was over, but its echo lingered in Liana like a quiet undertow, not because of the complexity or the outcome, but because something old had stirred again. The way she and Julian worked together, the near-silent rhythm between them, the brush of gloved hands and glances behind surgical masks, it all left her more unsettled than any argument ever could. Because this time, there were no words, no promises, just a feeling that maybe not everything had disappeared. She knew she shouldn't hope. But the heart, when it beats in an old familiar rhythm, has a way of forgetting how badly it once broke. That afternoon, as she gathered her things to leave the hospital, a voice called softly behind her. "Liana, do you have a minute?" She turned and saw Eliza Warren's face, calm, sincere, no bright smile, no confident tone. Just a woman carrying something she needed to say. And for the first time, Liana realized maybe she didn't know the whole truth after all. Liana sat on the bench behind the hospital courtyard, a quiet spot rarely visited at dusk. Late autumn wind brushed past her skin, crisp but oddly comforting. She closed her eyes and breathed in. Everything inside her was still tangled. Soft footsteps approached. Eliza stopped beside her, holding 2 cups of hot cocoa. "You don't drink coffee after 5 p.m., right?" she said gently. Liana nodded, accepting the cup silently. Eliza sat beside her. A silence stretched between them, just long enough to feel safe. "Liana," Eliza began, "Julian and I?" "No." Eliza paused, then gave a quiet, almost tired smile. "We've shared operating rooms, late nights, even a couple of drinks after impossible surgeries. But it was never more than that, because I saw how he looked at someone else, and it was never me." Liana lowered her eyes. "I'm getting engaged," Eliza added with a soft smile. "To Adrian?" Liana looked up, visibly surprised. "Adrian? But it's been a little secret," Eliza said. "We kept it quiet while the hospital project was still in motion." She reached over, gently touching Liana's hand. "He's always been thinking about you. If you don't believe that, at least let him have a chance to tell you himself." That evening, as Liana walked toward the parking lot, she saw Julian waiting near her car, holding a small box. "I'm not here to push you into a conversation," he said when she reached him. "Just wanted to give you this." She took the box and opened it. Inside were old letters, yellowed, worn, but still neatly kept. "These are yours," he said, voice almost a whisper. "Letters from med school. Some never reached me. Some I read so many times I can still hear your voice in them. And the last one, I didn't open it until last year." Liana held them, her fingers trembling slightly. "You read it?" she asked. "I read them more times than I can count, but there's something you never knew." Julian explained. The colleague who once handled their mail, Nathan Ellis, had a long-standing grudge against him, and some of her letters had never reached him. "I only got part of your words. I never knew how much you were hurting," Julian said, eyes heavy. Liana was silent. Inside, something long broken began to align. "I didn't stay silent on purpose, Liana," he whispered. "I just didn't know. You were still waiting." A tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from clarity. "I thought I was the one left behind," she murmured. "And I thought you wanted to go," he said. Years of pain, silence, and misunderstanding, now exposed, raw and real. But with that truth came something else, a second chance, if they were still brave enough to take it. The truth didn't erase the past, but it placed everything back where it belonged, not to rewrite history, but to finally finish what had been left incomplete. For Liana and Julian, this wasn't a new chapter. It was the last page of an old one, written with all the courage they had taken years to reclaim. The message was simple. 8 p.m., Old Rooftop. Liana reread it more than once. There was no name, but she knew exactly who it was from, and she knew exactly where he meant. The 12th floor rooftop of St. Vincent, the place where, over 8 years ago, 2 exhausted med interns had shared instant noodles and a single blanket, lying side by side as they looked up at New York's night sky. No bright city lights, just stars and untouched dreams. She climbed the last few steps slowly, her heart beating deep, steady. The steel door leading to the rooftop had been left slightly ajar. From the crack, a warm golden light spilled through, filling the cold early winter air with something tender and familiar. Then she saw it. The rooftop was no longer just concrete and rust. Delicate strands of tiny golden lights lined the railing, forming a soft, glowing circle around the center. A velvet blanket had been laid over the old ground, surrounded by paper lanterns and flickering candles. White chrysanthemums, the flower she had once mentioned during a sleepless night, had been carefully arranged all around. Everything was so thoughtful. She didn't even dare breathe too loud, for fear it might shatter the moment. Julian stood in the center, wearing a simple gray shirt, hands folded in front of him, his eyes filled with the kind of stillness that made time itself seem to pause. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice low and calm. "I wasn't sure either," she replied, stepping closer. He reached for her hand, an old gesture, yet it still made her chest tighten. "You once said," Julian smiled faintly, "that if anyone ever proposed to you, you didn't need it to be fancy. You just wanted it to happen somewhere private, somewhere filled with memory." Liana looked at him, her eyes glistening. "And I never thought you'd remember that." "There's nothing about you I've forgotten," he said. Soft piano music began to play from a small speaker nearby, the same instrumental melody she had always listened to after long, draining shifts. It wasn't a grand song, just something that had made her feel safe. He remembered that too. He remembered everything. Julian took a step back and pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. The soft rooftop lights reflected off the aquamarine stone inside, modest, not flashy, but stunning in its quiet clarity. Just like her. "I used to think we'd missed our chance," he began, "that you'd closed the chapter and moved on, while I didn't know how to step forward. But then the truth reminded me, you never really left my heart, and if there's even a fragile chance left, I'll take it." He knelt, not too formally, not rehearsed. Just a man placing his entire heart in front of the woman who once meant everything. "Liana Monroe, will you marry me? Let me be your final safe place. Not perfect, just real." Liana's breath caught. Her voice trembled when she finally said the 2 words, "I will." Tears fell, not from sorrow, but because something beautiful had finally come home after a journey far too long, far too lonely. Julian stood, slipping the ring onto her finger, not rushed, not shaking. His hands were still the one place where she felt entirely at peace. They embraced beneath the swaying lights under New York's star-filled sky. There were no more words, because every word already spoken, every wound once carried, had dissolved into the softest silence of all. No grand crowd, no dramatic moment. Just 2 hearts, finally beating again in sync after all the years they'd been apart. The next morning, Liana sat at her desk facing her computer. Her fingers hovered over the mouse, then clicked into the internal transfer request form. Just a few lines, but enough to rewrite an entire life. "I hereby request to transfer permanently to the Department of Sports Surgery, St. Vincent." Attached to the request was a simple email, sent only to Julian. "I've come back, and this time, I'm staying." 2 months later. The glass garden behind St. Vincent Hospital, once just a modest healing space for recovering patients, was now wrapped in the colors of a very different kind of day. Morning sunlight filtered through the transparent ceiling, casting a soft golden hue over rows of white chairs, hanging bouquets, and drifting silk ribbons. Gentle music floated through the air, blending with light laughter and familiar voices. Liana stepped out from behind a white curtain, holding a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums. Simple, pure, just like the journey that had brought her here. Along the aisle, tiny hands waved excitedly. Former pediatric patients she had once saved, now dressed in miniature white dresses and flower crowns, serving as honorary bridesmaids. Among them was Emma, the little girl with a fractured femur from last year, now skipping and giggling through her doctor's wedding. Julian stood at the end of the aisle, eyes fixed on her and only her. In his gaze there was no hesitation, no fear of loss, only the quiet awe of a man who knew how lucky he was to have this woman choose to return to him. The ceremony was simple but breathtaking, like something plucked from a dream. No stage, no spectacle. Just two people who had weathered storms standing side by side. This time, forever. When the officiant invited the couple to speak, Liana turned toward Julian, her hand tightening around his. "I used to think," she began, her voice trembling slightly but steady, "that I'd never come back to this place. Not because I hated it, but because it held too many memories. Ones I thought I couldn't bear to face again." She paused, then smiled through eyes shining with emotion. "But then I realized, memories aren't something to run from. They're where I first loved, and was loved. And today, in this very place, I want to tell you something." She leaned in and whispered into Julian's ear, "We're going to have someone else joining us soon." Julian froze. His eyes widened, his lips parted in disbelief, then slowly turned into the softest, most stunned smile. He gripped her hand tighter, like holding on to something miraculous. "Are you sure?" She nodded, eyes gleaming with tears. For a few seconds, the small garden was silent, then burst into applause, laughter, and joyful shouts from friends, colleagues, and the tiny patients who had once been part of their journey. That evening, after the reception had ended, Julian and Liana quietly returned to the 12th floor rooftop, the place where it had all begun. The wind was soft, the sky clear, and the stars above twinkled as if offering their blessing for the life that lay ahead. Julian spread out the same familiar blanket. They sat side by side, hands entwined, not needing to say much at all. This time, when they looked up at the stars, both of them knew. They had spent years chasing what was lost. But tonight, beneath a sky unchanged, they finally looked forward, not with fear, but with hope. A future that would hold a tiny heartbeat, gentle mornings filled with laughter, and two hearts, once broken, now healed, for good.